From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
It is my honor today to introduce Mr. Paul Rudnick. Mr. Rudnick is an American playwright, novelist, screenwriter, and essayist. His plays have been produced both on and off Broadway and around the world. Rudnick was born and raised in Piscataway, New Jersey, where his mother, Selma, was a publicist and his father, Norman, was a physicist. Rudnick attended Yale College before moving to New York City, where he wrote his book jacket copy and worked as an assistant to his friend, the costume designer, William Ivy Long. Rudnick began writing for magazines, including Esquire, Vogue, Vanity Fair, and Spy. Rudnick's first play was Poor Little Lambs, a comedy about a female Yale student's attempt to join the Whiffenpoofs, an all-American male singing group. The play's cast included the young then Kevin Bacon, Bronson Pinchot, and Blanche Baker. Rudnick then wrote two novels, Social Disease, a satiric tale of New York's nightlife in the vein of Evelyn Waugh's Vile Bodies, and I'll Take It, which was a tribute to Rudnick's mother and aunts and their passionate love of shopping. In the late 1980s, Rudnick moved into the top floor of a Greenwich Village brownstone, which had once been the 1920s home of the actor John Barrymore. That inspired Rudnick's play, I Hate Hamlet, about a young TV star who, as he's about to play Hamlet, is visited by the ghost of Barrymore. In 1993, Rudnick had a breakthrough with his off-Broadway hit, Jeffrey. Rudnick has won an Obie Award, an Outer Critics Circle Award, and the John Gassner Playwriting Award. Rudnick's later plays included The Naked Eye, which depicted an extreme photographer along the lines of Robert Mapplethorpe. Rudnick has worked as an accredited script doctor on movies including The Addams Family and The First Wives Club. In 2011, HarperCollins published I Shudder, a collection of Rudnick's autobiographical essays, some covering his work on stage and screen. Since 1998, Rudnick has been a frequent contributor to The New Yorker, mostly of over 50 short humor pieces. His work appears in the collections of Fierce Pajamas and Disquiet Please. In May 2013, Scholastic published Gorgeous, Rudnick's first adult novel. Publishers Weekly, in a starred review, said that the book was hilarious, profane, and profound. And in January 2016, his latest book, Scholastic published, It's All Your Fault. New York Times says, caution, do not read in public, will cause you to laugh and maybe cry out loud. Everyone, please help me welcome to the stage Mr. Paul Rudnick.
Oh, thank you for that wonderful introduction. And thank all of you so much for being here, and thank you. I was told that at these talks, the absolute worst sin was to read anything from cards or notes, so I'm not going to do that, so here goes. What I wanted to talk about today was probably the most common question that writers always get, which is, where do you get your ideas from? And I had immediately thought of so many awful answers to that, like Walmart, or you steal them. But what I found, and I think this happens to a lot of other writers as well, is if you're yearning to write something and the rent is due, you'll often try to do something like sit down with your notebook open and make lists and try to figure out, okay, what's a great idea? What should I do next? Usually those ideas vanish instantly. Even if they feel sort of wonderful and inspired at the moment, they somehow just don't take hold. What I find is there has to be something in my life and in the larger world that becomes so overwhelming that it insists on being written about. It can be personal or it can be larger than that, but it's something where you find yourself helplessly drawn to it and you just have to start writing whether you like it or not. So I wanted to share kind of 3 brief moments of that sort of inspiration. The first, actually, which was mentioned in the introduction, was years ago when I first moved to New York. And this will show you how long ago this was, because it involves real estate. This was when, if you wanted an apartment, you could actually look at the real estate listings in the New York Times or the Village Voice, wander over to a building, take a look, wait a day or so before deciding to pay the very low rent, and there you had an apartment. This has been unheard of for about the past 30 years now. But when I first arrived, I saw a listing, I think it was in the Times, that intrigued me because it said medieval duplex. And I thought, okay, what's medieval about it? You know, is it the plumbing? Is it the landlord? So I went, and it was the top floor of a brownstone right off Washington Square. So it was the romantic ideal of every young artist moving to New York. It was a garret, basically, but a very nice one. It was the full top floor, and it had been the nest of John Barrymore, the famous actor, who lived there actually beginning at around 1901 when he was playing Hamlet on Broadway. And he remodeled the whole place as something which he called the Alchemist's Corner. So it really had the most marvelous, enchanted feeling. There were stained glass windows and an enormous skylight, and up on the roof there was a tiny cottage, which from my research I found out Barrymore had planted the entire roof and added a reflecting pool, all of which was not up to code, so it eventually collapsed into the apartment below. But that had been repaired by the time I got there. So I looked around with a real estate agent, and I was immediately drawn to it, but I wasn't quite sure. So that night I went home and I called my very first agent, this wonderful woman named Helen Merrill, who even then was already in her 70s and very German. She'd moved to Germany before the war as a refugee, but still had the thickest accent. And I said, Helen, I'm looking at this apartment with this Barrymore pedigree. And she said, oh, Rudnick, perhaps you have found my hairpins. Because it turned out that Helen had had an affair with Barrymore's son-in-law on the premises. So at that point, it sort of became impossible not to write about the apartment, especially once I'd moved in. And I began writing a novel that was called I Hate Hamlet, because it felt like a literary Greenwich Village thing to do. But eventually, because it was about actors and it was all set in a single room, it became a play. I just let it happen. And it eventually ended up on Broadway in a sort of wildly adventurous and traumatic run, because what happened was we cast this insane, wildly alcoholic English actor named Nicol Williamson was playing the ghost of John Barrymore. And he was the kind of guy who the first time I met him was at a restaurant where the table was filled with 2 empty wine bottles, a can of beer, a few cocktails, and because he was so known as a drunkard, when someone asked, are you still drinking? He said, no, not in months. And there was that moment where he thought, do we point to the glassware? You know, and I just thought, I hope for the best. And Nicol, on his good nights, could be inspired, and the play just soared. And on his lesser nights, the first act ended with a big climactic duel, a sword fight that took place all over the stage. And Nicol's co-star was the very young actor named Evan Handler, who you may know from Sex and the City and all sorts of television things. And Evan was wonderfully talented and wonderfully patient as well. But Nicol did not want any co-star, let alone one who was much younger than he was. Nicol had called me one morning at 3 a.m. to tell me that he felt he could play both leading roles. It's one of those questions where you don't know, do I ask how you would have a sword fight with yourself? But Nicol took it into his head, and then one night during the run during the sword fight, he took after Evan for real and stabbed him and drew blood. And I was not there that evening, but the next day I came downstairs and the full front page of the New York Post said, "I hit Hamlet. Star stabs actor in the butt." Which, if you know the paper, it's sort of New York Post poetry. So that was that kind of experience, which from that moment of walking into an apartment, I never knew where this was headed, but I knew I had to write about it. So that was my first moment of, okay, inspiration appears from anywhere. The next thing I'd like to get into was more serious and affected far more people, which was, by that point, we were into late 80s, early 90s, and I was a gay man living in New York, and so many people, an overwhelming amount of people I knew were sick or dying of AIDS. And it was a terrifying time. This was before there were any treatments. This was while the government was completely ignoring the illness. This was where even medical personnel were unwilling sometimes to treat or touch people who were infected. And because I'm a comic writer, at that time I couldn't imagine that I had any place in writing about the plague years and about the people I knew. It just felt like the most awful contradiction. But then one day, actually, it was also mentioned in my introduction, a dear friend of mine, William Ivey Long, who is a true Southern gentleman and a brilliant Tony Award-winning costume designer. He and I were going to the hospital to visit another good friend of ours named Eric, who was very, very ill and would die. And Eric was emaciated, was hallucinating, and also his room was quarantined. It was still everything about it only got worse. But Eric, what was so strange is Eric had many friends, so he was being visited quite a bit, but he was refusing to kind of live up to his role as a noble sick person. And why should he? But Eric was doing things like demanding exactly the right shade of towels in the right amount of Egyptian cotton. And if you brought him a beverage, it had to be, grapeade, not limeade, not lemonade. If you brought him the fashion magazines that he loved, they had to be French Vogue and Italian Vogue because American Vogue was trashy. So he became so insistent on everything and nothing was ever good enough. And of course, because he was in such a terrible state, we wanted to please him and do anything to ease what he was going through. But that morning of that visit, William and I went out to a park bench in front of the hospital afterwards, after a couple of hours of being harangued. And William turned to me and he said, I love Eric very dearly, and I will do anything for him, but my God, I want to slap him. And we both looked at each other, and the whole situation was so unbearably awful and tragic that all we could do was burst out laughing. And I realized that so many of the people I knew were getting through all of this with the only weapon in their possession, which was a sense of humor, that people were marching and people were helping and people were joining ACT UP in every possible organization. But these were some of the most stylish and funny and extraordinary people I'd ever met, men and women, gay and straight. It just was... It's something to behold. And I thought, okay, that's what I want to write about. And that moment and all of the stuff that seems impossible and all of the stuff that somehow becomes hilarious in the face of death. So I wrote this play called Jeffrey. And it was about a guy. It was funny. Again, it was a character that began in another play I was working on about another sort of story entirely, but there was this one guy who was giving up sex, who thought that was the only possible way to deal with the AIDS crisis, was kind of to run from it and to run from romance and to run from any kind of personal contact. And that seemed like a strong storyline, so that became the center. And once I'd written the play, Helen, my agent again, submitted it to every theater in New York, all of whom turned it down. Even the people who liked it would write me letters saying, while I enjoyed this, our audience would never stand for it. It just became known. They said, how can you have a comedy about AIDS? And Helen finally went to a tiny theater on 23rd Street called the WPA, and she sat outside the artistic director's office and would not leave till he read the play, and then wouldn't leave until he agreed to do it. And he was the man named Kyle Rennick, who was wonderful, and I was just so grateful. So it was set for like a 3-week run. Every actor in New York was warned away from this play. They were told it would ruin their careers. They were told it was far too gay. And it was the worst things you can do to actors is try to scare them about completely ridiculous concerns. So the people we ended up with, I just was so deeply grateful for. They were so talented and that they were willing to show up. So we did the play, and I remember we had a terrible dress rehearsal, and then the first preview was on New Year's Eve for some odd reason, and it went really well. And my mom was there. I was sitting behind her, and then when my mom would watch things, her shoulders would be kind of up around her ears until the audience started laughing and responding, and then they gradually settled, which meant things were okay. But I was flooded with what I always think of as the highest form of happiness, which is relief. And the play opened and was very well received and people just flocked to it because there was a sense of, it was almost like a town meeting where these were matters that were on everyone's mind, and no one was sure how to respond, and no one was sure if it was okay to laugh. And the play kind of made that understandable at the very least. And it moved on, it ran off Broadway for about a year. And I was just it was the first thing I'd ever written where I felt that my voice was completely heard and that I was proud of the work that I'd done. And I was then told by many people, oh, this play will be done in New York, maybe LA or San Francisco, but nowhere else. And then it was produced all around the world. And so again, it just felt like this, gift. And although what was odd was I remember in some other countries, they would change the title. And I remember for some reason in Paris, they changed the title to Sex, Drugs, and Sequins. I like productions of my play in languages I don't speak because I don't have to worry about them. I just assume they're going well. But so it was such a lesson in, okay, write about something that scares you. Write about the thing that is most critical to your life aside from writing. Write about something that might actually matter to people. And the fact that the audiences were responding just meant the world to me. And it just opened everything up for me. Then the third thing I'd like to talk about is my first venture into YA, which was with the help of my Scholastic, my wonderful publisher. Because what I wanted to write about was beauty in every possible sense, why it doesn't matter in the slightest, why it can affect everyone's lives helplessly. And I'd been offered a number of projects set in fashion worlds and that kind of thing. I was also one of the writers on the movie of The Devil Wears Prada. There are often on films, there are a batch of writers. And the woman, Elaine Brosh McKenna, who was credited, did a magnificent job. And she, I think, borrowed certain elements from everybody's draft, but it ended up being very much her work. But it was a wonderful introduction to that world. I'd also written at Vogue and had met Anna Wintour, who's an extraordinary person. But I thought, okay, what's the way into this world? What is it, just froth? How do you make it somehow larger? And then my mom became very ill. She was diagnosed with ovarian cancer and went through the whole process of chemotherapy, doctor visits, you name it. Although I think something that pleased my mother enormously, my partner John is here, who's a physician. And my cousin Carl is also a doctor. So my mom would go to the doctor accompanied by two handsome young doctors. So this was kind of Jewish mom nirvana for her. And it was sort of wonderful to watch. But I was going through this with her, and there were two things that really struck me. One, she was going through a lot of clippings and mementos from her past. And she found, I think during during the Second World War, she actually had written an advice column, and there was a pic photo of a very young version of my mom at the top of each column. And she looked at it, and she said, back then I thought I was so ugly. And she said, and I looked great. And then she laughed, and it was both horribly sad and joyous because my mom had an incredible sense of humor. And what happened after that was during the chemo, she lost all her hair. And probably right before she was about to lose it all, when she knew that was upon her, I found through William Ivey Long a theatrical hairstylist who'd worked on Phantom of the Opera, Hairspray, a lot of shows. He came to her apartment and shaved her head, which gave it a certain flair. And she said that somehow allowed her to accept what was going on a bit more. And then after the chemo, her hair grew back. And I should preface this by saying all the women in my mother's family, that a lot of them were librarians and teachers, and they were extraordinary women and sort of very strict-minded, and they all had hair all the way down their backs, which they kept in buns, tightly tied at the nape of their necks. That was the proper way to do things. They thought anything fussy or any visit to the beauty parlor, let alone any highlighting, was considered vain and prideful and ultimately Gentile. So they stayed far away. So my mom, throughout her entire life, had had only one very severe hairstyle, which she looked beautiful, but it was still, that was the rule. So as her hair grew back, it was still very short, but it was also wonderfully curly and brilliantly silver. And when she looked at it, she became so joyful. She just laughed, and she had just never allowed herself that sort of personal moment to enjoy how she looked. And it came out of the worst possible circumstances. So that sense of the power of beauty and the burden of beauty was what inspired my book, Gorgeous. And it was the first, well, actually it wasn't the first time I'd ever sort of wandered into fantasy, because certainly Hate Hamlet had a ghost. But what I thought of was, and it was something that also took a while to land in terms of, was it a play, was it a film, about a girl from a very small town in Appalachia who grew up in a trailer park, whose mom was morbidly obese, and who dies and sort of tells her daughter right before she dies that something wonderful is going to happen. And when it does, she needs to say yes. And she needs to accept the magic that's going to appear. And the girl then receives all sorts of mysterious messages. She's flown to New York, where she meets a very powerful and not all that pleasant, but clearly very gifted Manhattan designer named Tom Kelly, who makes her an offer. He says, I will make you 3 dresses, one red, one white, and one black. And if you agree to wear them, you will become the most beautiful woman who has ever lived. And at first she thinks this is, of course, nonsense. Then she decides, no, her mother's deathbed wish was say yes, so she does. And he does, and that's what happens in the rest of the book. So it's this very wild and comic adventure, but it's with a very serious underpinnings about what does it mean for this girl who's very smart and very savvy, and she sees how beauty works in the world, and she sees how money works and celebrity and everything that's very alluring and can seem very important and can be quite destructive. But because I thought, no, I want this girl to win, she figures out how to kind of lasso the power of all that. And well, if you read the book, I'll just say one thing, she does end up as the Queen of England. So again, it was an idea that sort of had circled for a long time and then finally landed with the help of all of these very powerful events in my life. So I think if I was ever going to give advice to writers, which I should never do, but I think sometimes you could tie yourself up in knots and think, oh my God, I'm not a writer. I don't know what to do with myself. Everything I do sours. And I think, no, it will find you. At least that's been the case with me, that's been the joy of my life, and it can drive you mad because you sometimes think, oh my God, I'll never have another idea again. Nothing will ever descend. And then suddenly, it's interesting. My most current projects there was after the recent massacre in Orlando, a new play just sort of poured out of me, and completely unexpected. Again, it was one of those things where I thought, oh my God, this is the worst kind of tragedy. And yet I want to find something celebratory in the world's response to that, and something both tormented and ultimately healing in some way. So that is now underway. And beyond that, I got a call a few days ago from the New Yorker saying, Paul, we need something about Brad and Angelina by Thursday. And that's the kind of challenge I like. Also, the trouble is, though, when you get a request like that, you think, this is what we call a developing story. So I thought, okay. And also, it's so odd when I write things like that for the New Yorker that are often very contemporary, and you're dealing with, and you suddenly start to think, wait, you don't want to attack Brad and Angelina. I thought the world is doing plenty of that. On the other hand, it's playing out on this, on every possible form of social media, and it's delicious. And you also think just why do movie stars ever marry each other? You know, it just, haven't they read the tabloids about the person they're marrying? You know, can they ever be surprised? And you sort of admire the noble belief in, oh yeah, this time it's going to work out. And on the other hand, you think, okay, you're ignoring everything. But so it was juicy stuff. So if you read The New Yorker next week, you'll see what emerged, because I tried to find an angle on it, because you think, okay, you don't want, sort of straight ahead almost never works, because then it's not funny, it's not personal, it's not, or it's not fresh. So I finally, kind of with that time pressure, it's also why I love writing for The New Yorker, is because with plays and books and films, you could take years towards the final product, and sometimes it can still evaporate. But with The New Yorker, you write it, and there you get to see it, and the world gets to comment on it, for better or for worse, and that's a real excitement. And I grew up reading The New Yorker, so I feel, you know, wonderfully grateful to be included there. So anyway, that's how for me at least, that's how ideas sort of approach. So so now if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Anybody? Go ahead, come on, pretend I'm Lois Lowry. Pretend I'm that rich. And that wonderful, yes.
How would you like create your humor? Because like I tried to write like humorous stuff, and it comes out like of the ha 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 moments.
Yeah, that's a very good question about how do you write humor. I find I come from a family that really valued humor. So, you know, the dinner table, all of that stuff, it was just an unending sense of comedy, and that there was always also a sense that humor was a great balance wheel. If you started to take yourself too seriously or feel a little too smug, that somebody could sort of land a choice punchline, and that would take care of you. But I think the best way is maybe don't try to deliberately write comedy. Write about the story and the characters you're interested in. And if they're going to be funny, that will happen. That, in a way, the comedy sometimes will take care of itself. So that you can, it's especially hard, I think, when you're writing books and things, to wonder, will people laugh at this? You can lose yourself and think, is any of this funny? Is this awful? Or is this hilarious? So I think it's one of the few things where you don't have to worry it to death. You know, think, sometimes something I'll write that I would imagine was very serious, then when it's read aloud or somebody, or it becomes a play, it's hilarious. And sometimes I'm not even sure why they're laughing, but I'm very happy that they do. So yeah, I would say don't beat yourself up about comedy. You know, let it find you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Mr. Rudnick, I only know your work from The New Yorker, although I'm eager to read it in other forms. And I just wanted to say that I loved the piece you did recently called My Demands. And I hope that Leah Ellen Altschuler and the whole campus at the Shower of Blessings Junior Bible College will come to life in some form, whether it's in more pieces in The New Yorker or a book or a movie or a play. But I wanted to say that what I loved about it was that you took a character who I, at least, and probably many other New Yorker readers, might have dismissed as you know, according to our preconceived notions of what she would be like, and you showed real compassion and love for her. And so that's why I want to know more about her.
Oh, well, thank you. No, I'm so glad. No, this was a piece. It's funny, actually, my most recent YA book from Scholastic, It's All Your Fault, deals with a similar character, a girl who was homeschooled and brought up in sort of a deeply religious and deeply devout atmosphere. And I thought, no, it's easy to use those people as targets, especially if you're from the East Coast. And I thought, no, that wears itself out in about, 2 sentences. So I thought, because actually the people I know who've been homeschooled are some of the most sweet-natured, genuinely innocent people, because they haven't been socialized in the American public school system, where you get bullied and beaten up all the time, and you kind of learn to, develop a very, sometimes too thick skin, so that these even as adults, a lot of homeschooled people have a genuine sort of optimism about them that I really admire. And in that case, with that piece, it was also about what's going on all the time on today's campuses, trigger warnings and safe spaces, and that whole sense of students, because my heart, I think the students are often absolutely right or crazily wrong, but I think, no, that's what that college life and that age is all about. I think you are allowed to say absurd and strident things and find your way in the world. At the same time, your heart goes out to the professors who have to deal with, there was that one student at Yale who kept howling at a professor that she didn't want to hear him talk, she just wanted to talk about her pain. And then someone, of course, mentioned, you come from a very nice neighborhood. I don't know where quite was the pain involving dry cleaning. But it was, so I thought, but again, that's such rich comic turf because it's, it's like the current election, when you've got so many opinionated people howling at each other, they're usually very funny. But yes?
My question is, out of everything you've ever written, what is the finished product that was the most different from the idea that initially inspired it, or your first conception of what it would look like?
It's an interesting question about one thing I've learned sort of in a hard-won manner is to let it surprise me. So things often start quite differently. It's funny, there was one thing that happened once when I was called in to overhaul The First Wives Club, the movie. And the script I was given, there had been many drafts, was very serious, believe it or not, given the final movie. And I remember one of the features of it, if you've seen the film, Diane Keaton has a daughter in it who is a lesbian. And in the original draft, that character was mentally disabled. And she was, the word back then used was retarded. And they said, Paul, could you please make this character into a lesbian? And I kind of course, being an idiot, I first said, well, why not both? But it was just the most absurd leap. But on the other hand, they had these wonderful stars, and I went to work, and the movie was about to start shooting, and I thought, okay, how do you turn this tragic story of these women who've been treated badly by their husbands and abandoned into this sort of powerful statement about these women's friendship and revenge and Manhattan lives? And when it's a tribute to the film's producer, a guy named Scott Rudnick, who's a genius, because it was the whole shoot was insane. Nobody was getting along. The director was having all sorts of problems. And I thought, this thing is doomed. And I told Scott, I said, I can't see this once it opens. It's just going to be too god-awful. And he said, he had been working on it personally then for a long, long time. And he said, okay, you have to come see it at least once. You have to come to the opening. And I said, oh, all right. And it's delightful. I mean, thanks to the director and to Scott and to editing and everything that can be done in movies, and it's kind of only in movies, it worked. It's still an unholy mess, but it's a delightful unholy mess. So it was, again, it's the kind of thing where it's very hard to duplicate that process, to say, okay, how do I take something in big trouble and save it? But it sure worked that time. Since then, I go into things thinking you just hope for the best, see what will work. But nothing. If you try too hard to stick to your original outline or that image you had in your head of the finished work, you're doomed. You'll kill yourself. And because often what you discover along the way is so much better. So it's probably answer is everything ends up very different. I remember Jeffrey was originally called Keep It in Your Pants. And then when I called it Jeffrey, I love one of the producers, this wonderful man who's heterosexual. He told me, he said, Paul, I like that title. I like calling it Jeffrey because I know it's a gay play, but I have no idea why. I thought you are absolutely right. So again, it's the kind of thing where, well, actually, no, I'll try to be very quick then. I also wrote Sister Act originally for Bette Midler, who took many years and finally said no because she kept saying, I can't play a nun. And even though everyone around her kept saying, you're not playing a nun, you're playing a showgirl disguised one, she kept saying no, and then it ended up being made with Whoopi Goldberg and becoming a huge success. So go figure. And Bette, years later, God bless her, came to me and said, why did I turn that down? That was terrible. And I thought, thank you, Bette. But so it's just, it's a question of just staying open to everything, I think.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, now I'm being told that our time is up, but again, thank you all so much for being here. This has been a delight.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.